Welcome, and thank you for joining today's DMM report on the Resource Sufficiency Evaluation. Before we begin, please ensure you've opened the WebEx chat panel by using the associated icon on the bottom right corner of your screen. Please note that all audio connections are muted until the Q&A portions of the call. You may enter the question queue at any time by clicking the raised hand emoticon at the bottom of WebEx. Attendees dialed in via phone only may dial #2. You'll hear a notification when you are unmuted, at which point please state your name, the company you represent, and your question. You're also welcome to submit written questions throughout the presentation, and these will be addressed during Q&A. To submit your question in writing, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, enter your question in the message box provided, and send. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, I'll turn the conference over to Kyle Westendorf. Please go ahead.
Hello, good morning, everyone. This is Kyle Westendorf with the Department of Market Monitoring. Before I begin, let me again say that the call is being recorded and will be available on the ISO website. Also, the presentation today should not be reprinted or quoted without permission by the ISO. I will leave plenty of time for questions throughout the presentation, but please enter questions in the chat or dial in to the information when those times arise. I want to start with a reminder that DMM has been publishing special reports on the resource efficiency evaluation every month. The most recent is the report covering July 2023. The reason for the call today is to go over some of the recent changes to the resource efficiency evaluation and then highlight some of the new metrics there. So first, the calculation for net load uncertainty was adjusted on February 1st. And then also the implementation of Phase 2 Track 1 of RSC enhancements was implemented on July 1st. And before I get to the changes to the RSC, I thought it would be helpful for folks to do a short overview of the capacity and flexibility test. I'll focus on the upward test here, but it's going to be the same concepts but reversed generally for the downward test. This slide is starting with the capacity test. The idea here is that if the import and generation base schedules are below the export base schedules and the load forecast, then the upward test requires incremental bid-in capacity above those base schedules to cover the difference. So looking at the graphic on the left, it's pretty straightforward. If the left column is higher than the right column, then the entity passes the test. And then the graphic on the right is just showing what is counted in that incremental bid-in capacity at the resource level. And it's basically all bid-in capacity that exists above the generation base schedules, but below any derate, outage, or upward ancillary service schedule. Now, I will say this is a fairly high-level overview of the test. There are other details, for example, how battery and offline resources are treated. But this is the main idea of what the capacity test is measuring. And let me move on to the flexibility test here, just a little bit more complicated. The key to understanding the flexibility test is to understand that everything is measured relative to the schedule from the 15-minute market interval right before the test hour. So let's first look at the graphic on the left. The first two columns show the interval right before the hour. So here, the load forecast in yellow is balanced by generation, net imports outside of the WEIM, and then net WEIM imports. So with energy balanced in that previous interval, the flexibility test asks the question, does the WEM entity have sufficient upward flexible capacity to maintain that balance in the upcoming hour by meeting the expected change in the load forecast as well as uncertainty? And if you look at the graphic on the right, what's important to keep in mind here is that the amount in the light blue includes all of the fixed effects of intertie and generation changes. So that's what's shown in the green and the orange. So again, that's going to be all counted relative to the reference interval before the hour. So for example, if a solar forecast is decreasing at the end of the day, that would be counted as negative upward ramping capacity. Or if the export schedule is decreasing from the previous hour, effectively lower demand, that would be counted as positive upward ramping capacity. And then the yellow at the top is the actual upward flexibility that exists, so what resources can ramp to. And that's going to be accounting for all resource limitations and ramp constraints. So in the end, the amount in the light blue is the net of all of the fixed effects plus any actual upward flexibility that exists. And to pass the test, that amount just needs to exceed the change in load plus uncertainty. Again, this is a bit simplified. There are other details like diversity benefit and credits that can reduce the requirement. But for now, this is the basics of the flexibility test. I can pause and see if there's any questions at this point. Otherwise, I can move on to the main content of the presentation.
I'm not showing any hands raised at this time.
Okay, let me move on to net load uncertainty. This is included in the requirement for the flexibility test. It is currently not included in the capacity test. The calculation for uncertainty was adjusted on February 1st using a method called mosaic quantile regression. If you go to DMM's monthly reports, they do go into much more detail, really step by step how these regressions are set up. But for this presentation, the short of it is that it runs a series of regressions on historical data and then uses the output of those regressions to calculate uncertainty in the present based on current load, solar, and wind forecast information. And I've added a few other notes here. The regressions are run based on historical observations from the previous 180 days and for the same hour. The amount in the test is still based on uncertainty that might materialize around the next 15-minute market interval. It's still based on a 95% confidence interval. So what you have at the end, the result of the regressions, are a series of coefficients, and those coefficients define the relationship between the forecast information and the extreme ends of uncertainty that might materialize. Okay, I see, I can answer now. I see a question. My hand was raised.
Hi, Kyle. This is JK Wang from PG&E. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hi, Kyle. I have a question about the regression coefficients. You mentioned that's combined with the current low solar, wind, and forecast. I remember in the MSA meeting, we once raised the question that the combined coefficient may not consider the correlation of the uncertainties, and they just add those up. Was the issue be revised, or it is still as was being described, like they just sum up all the uncertainties?
So I'll first say that DMM is planning on printing a future report that's going to go more into the details of the regression and some of the potential concerns with the modeling. I think at this time we still have some questions about the effectiveness of the model, but for this presentation, I don't want to go into some of those issues.
Sure. I think I would just try to clarify, like the current coefficient. It's still the original. It's still the original method described by the Kaiser.
It is
right?
still the original.
Okay.
It hasn't changed since February 1st. That's right.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you for answering the question. Thanks.
JK, I'll just add to that there is a section in the monthly reports that I think does a very good job of breaking down the estimated, the equation that's being estimated, so that you can see exactly how that the mosaic variable is constructed.
Thanks, Amelia. Are you referring to the monthly report of Kaiser or DMM?
The DMM
from the DMM
monthly RSC reports, yeah.
Okay, is that for every month or just for July?
Right. So every month since February, we've been posting the details about the regression. So like the step-by-step calculation of how it's all set up.
Okay, we'll look up to that. Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Sure, of course. Okay, so on this slide, we're pointing out that there are two what are called thresholds, which are in place to cap the uncertainty calculated from the quantile regression method. These thresholds are a safety net of sorts, really intended to help prevent some of the extreme outlier or bad underlying data from impacting the final uncertainty. In the bullets, I have some of the differences between these thresholds. So they use different methods for calculating uncertainty. They use different time periods for the historical data. One is updated each day, the other is updated each quarter. But the point is that there are two thresholds in place which can cap the calculated uncertainty, and it's going to be the lower of those two thresholds that's capping the uncertainty. And then the metric here shows the percent of intervals in which the calculated uncertainty for each balancing area was capped by one of these two thresholds in July. And it's separate for upward and downward uncertainty. So what you can see here is that the caps are used pretty commonly. So like reaching 20% of intervals for many of the balancing areas or even higher. And then on this slide, it's showing that there is also a floor for uncertainty, which is set at 0.1 megawatts. So like as an example, if the calculated upward uncertainty, coming out of the regression and forecast information, if that came out negative, it would be set instead near 0. So what I'm showing here is the percent of intervals in July in which that floor kicked in. This is going over one of the metrics we include in the reports for all WEIM entities. In this example, it's showing NV energy during July. And the positive lines are going to be for upward uncertainty, and the negative lines are for downward uncertainty. The blue lines show the average uncertainty during July from the quantile regression method. The green lines show the average uncertainty from the histogram method. The histogram method was the more simplistic method that was in place prior to February, based on just the historical 2.5th and 97.5th percentile of observations in the distribution. But what you can see here is that the average uncertainty from the regression method is less than the average uncertainty from the histogram method. So the blue lines are below the green. And I'll say that I did pick NV energy as an example on this slide because it was one of the balancing areas with the largest difference between the regression and histogram uncertainty. But it is the trend that we see across most balancing areas, that the regression uncertainty is typically less compared to the histogram uncertainty. I did see a hand was raised, so let me, I can take that now. Is that a?
This is Robert Fisher with NV Energy. No question in regards to us being in the slide, but you did bring up a slide that I had previously flagged as a question that I have. You talked about the average uncertainty histogram, so the old methodology. Is this something that you guys are maintaining the calculation for, or are you using the histogram calculation that is being published in OASIS?
Right. So the histogram method here is still is used as an input into the mosaic quantile regression, so it's still being calculated. I will say that there is one difference from the method that was in place prior to February. What I'm showing here in the green lines for the histogram method, which is also on OASIS and is used as an input, is based on historical data over the previous 180 days. So it's really like a difference between two different methods, both 180 days, but one's the histogram and one's regression, right? But before February, it would have been 40 days. So it's not quite like what would have been in place prior to February. It's more, what is the difference between these two methods, as of today?
Okay, thank you. That's a great clarification. Wasn't there also netting? And I'm asking purely because I don't recall in the previous histogram calculation versus these are the individual histogram calculations.
What do you mean by, can you clarify what you mean by netting?
Netting, so if load went up and solar went down, those two would net out.
Right, so before it was like very simplistic. You just take load minus wind minus solar as net load, and you subtract the actuals, the advisory and the binding, and you get a distribution of uncertainty, and just take the 2.5th and 97.5th percentile of observations. So if wind and solar was going in a direction that offset the load, you would end up with zero uncertainty, and that just wouldn't be picked as the 2.5th and 97.5th percentiles.
Gotcha. So but these are, so the data input was netted versus these are individual histogram calculations. So there's potential that netting could have affected the solution.
This is for each hour. It's the 2.5th and 97.5th percentiles. So it's the extreme, lower and end for each hour.
For each of the quantities, right? For each of the quantities. So one for load, one for.
No, so it's all, right. So for one single quantity of net load uncertainty, so it's not showing like net load, it's net load uncertainty. The difference from advisory 15-minute market interval minus a binding 5.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Sure. The other thing I wanted to bring up on this slide are the shaded areas around the blue and the green lines. Those show the minimum and maximum amount for each interval during the month. So you can see a big difference between the histogram and the regression methods here. With the histogram method, you can see by the green area around the green line that the range for each interval over the month is pretty small. So the uncertainty is quite predictable, quite static day after day for the same hour, because the minimum and maximum amount over the entire month is pretty small of a range. But with the regression method in the blue area, a natural consequence of incorporating current forecast information is that the calculated uncertainty is going to vary much more from day to day. So you end up with a much larger range for any interval over the month. And then the last two components on this metric are the thresholds I was talking about in the last slide. So the red and yellow lines show the histogram and the mosaic thresholds that cap uncertainty. So in this case, you can see the histogram threshold in the red was the more restrictive of the two, and was actually capping the calculated regression uncertainty in some intervals. So one aspect of the regression method that I touched on is that it is more difficult to predict in advance of the ROC hour. So, prior to February, before the enhancements, the uncertainty from the histogram approach that was used in the ROC, that was known in advance. I think it was like the day prior. But with the regression approach, the regression coefficients, those are known in advance, but the exact uncertainty is going to be dependent on the latest forecast information. So what this graphic shows is the difference between the calculated uncertainty from the first run of the ROC, which is at 75 minutes before the hour, to the second run of the ROC at 55 minutes before the hour. The load and renewable forecasts are held fixed between the second ROC and the final run. So the uncertainty between the T-minus 55 and T-minus 40 tests are going to be exactly the same. But the question is, how effective is that T-minus 75 uncertainty in predicting the final uncertainty that's used in the ROC? And in this metric, the dashed gray region is basically no difference from the first ROC. So like less than 1 megawatt and change. But the regions above and below show either increased uncertainty, above the gray lines, or decreased uncertainty, relative to that first run of the ROC. And what we've seen is that the difference from the first ROC is typically small, so less than 1 megawatts, less than 10 megawatts. But there are some cases of more significant increases, and that could lead to a unexpected test failure. So like if it increased like more than 50 megawatts, say. This is the last slide that I have on uncertainty. There are more metrics included in the report, like some of the basic summary statistics and coverage. Again, I'll say that we will be reporting more on the quantile regression in the future, and that from DMM's perspective, it is unclear how much of an improvement the new method actually is. We are seeing lower requirements overall, but also it's much more difficult to reproduce. It's more volatile. So just a point that there are some trade-offs to consider. Let me pause and see if there are any questions on uncertainty or the mosaic quantile regression.
We do have a hand raised. Just a quick reminder, if you would like to ask a question verbally, you can use the raise hand icon in WebEx. To join the queue, you'll hear a beep when your line is unmuted, at which point please state your name, the company you represent, and your question. If you are joined via audio only, you can dial #2 to enter the question queue. And we do have 2 callers in queue. We'll go to the first one. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Thank you. This is JK Wang from PG&E again. Kyle, thank you for sharing this graph. It's very helpful. I wonder if you have any insights or if DMM have done any analysis that shows the RSU results actually change from failure to pass or from pass to failure between the 2 tests, T-75 and T-55.
Yeah, that's a good question. We do post some analysis showing purely the difference between T55 and T40, fail going to pass or pass going to fail, but between those tests, like I said, uncertainty isn't going to change, and we don't have anything currently for the difference from T-75 to T-55. But that's something we can think about and maybe include in a future report.
Okay, that would be really appreciated. And my second question is, do you have any insights that the change between failure and pass, how it will impact the curtailment of exports from California to the other BAs? I guess I'm asking a question given the background that we have, EA events in July, and even though that, we passed the RSE test, California still call for EA events. So I wonder, if there's any connection between, the failure and the pass alteration and that consequence.
So there's a few points I'll make. The first is that the next section in the presentation is going to go over the interaction of exports and CAISO's RSE and some of the changes there.
Okay, I'll wait for that.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
That sounds good.
All right, we'll go to the next caller in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
This is Robert Fisher with NV Energy. JK asked my question, but I'd just like to voice my support to say it would be nice to have a metric in regards to if these increases have ever led to any failures.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. We'll look into that for the next report. Did I see a question just pop up in chat?
Question that popped up in the chat is from Mariano Mezzatesta, and if you could identify which company you represent, I'd appreciate it. And the comment is, as you all work to determine which approach is better, what are you looking for? How are you all defining better? For example, based on your comments, greater volatility and uncertainty seems not to be desired, and he's representing BPA.
I think ultimately it is up to the individual WEM entities to weigh in on what they value with these different improvements and trade-offs. But I will say at like a high level that we also want to confirm that the regression model is effectively forecasting uncertainty. Yeah, is there anything else? Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, let me move on to the next subject here. All right, the next section is going over the enhancements that were implemented on July 1st as part of Phase 2, Track 1 of RSC enhancements. And there were two big changes here. There was an adjustment to how real-time, low-priority, and economic exports are counted in CAISO's resource sufficiency evaluation. So this one does not affect other WEM entities. And then the second is the implementation of assistance energy transfers, which is a voluntary program open to all WEM entities. So let me go over both of these. All right, so with the first enhancement, again, there was an adjustment with how real-time, low-priority, and economic exports are counted in CAISO's resource sufficiency evaluation. For some background here, there was some analysis by the ISO that identified the potential for advisory WEIM imports coming into the ISO to support additional hourly exports in HASP. Those exports would then be counted as effectively higher demand in the test. So the enhancement is in part to remedy that interaction, really adjust how the real-time LPT and economic exports are counted, and in both the capacity and flexibility test. And I have two slides here that are going to go over the impact to the capacity test and flexibility test separately. It is a little bit different. This is for the capacity test, this slide. The metric is summarizing all export schedules included in CAISO's capacity test requirement during the peak hours between July 17th and July 27th. All export schedules are still included in CAISO's requirement as extra demand, but the change now is that the real-time LPT and economic exports, those schedules are also counted as incremental available capacity on the supply side of the equation. So it's going to cancel out. So the blue and green bars show the real-time LPT and economic exports that are, effectively removed from the capacity test requirement. And over this period, it was like just over 1,500 megawatts on average in real-time, low priority, and economic exports that were removed from the requirement. Then the other bars show, the exports that of higher priority, the day-ahead LPT, the high priority exports, the ETC and TORs, that would still be counted in CAISO's capacity test requirement strictly as extra demand. Okay, and then this metric shows the impact to the flexibility test. Before the enhancements, before July 1st, any change to an hourly export schedule from the previous hour to the current hour, that was accounted for in the total flexible ramping capacity. So, just like I was showing earlier, if a decrease to an hourly export schedule would be counted as positive upward ramping capacity, an increase would be counted as negative upward ramping capacity. Now, this is still exactly how the day-ahead LPTs, the high priority ETC and TORs are counted, and that's what I'm showing in the red, based on their change in the schedule from the previous hour to the current hour. The enhancement, though, is that the real-time LPT and economic exports, those are now counted as upward flexible capacity based on their schedule in the interval right before the hour. So, in other words, those exports are now assumed to be curtailable down to 0 in real time. So if you have 100 megawatts of a real-time LPT in the interval before the evaluation hour, it would be counted as 100 megawatts of upward flexible capacity in the evaluation hour because it's assumed that that schedule could be curtailed in real time. So that's what I'm showing in the blue bars. And then the gray bars show how the real-time LPT and economic exports would have been counted in the flexibility test before the enhancements, just based on the old change in schedule. So the difference between the gray and the blue bars is the impact of the enhancement. So in this period, the enhancement added something like over 1,000 megawatts on average between July 17th and July 27th. I saw a question came through, or a hand raised. I can take that now.
Last week.
Janice, you can go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Can you not hear me?
Yeah, you're very soft.
Well, I'm not sure how to talk louder. That is something that I've ever had. Is that better now?
No.
I can just barely make you out, but it's very faint.
Okay. My question is, and I hope you can hear me, I can speak as loudly as I can. So there was a meeting last week where the CAISO broke down the impacts of RT-LPT and the timing that if they were resubmitted in the Haas market, the Haas cleared at T-minus 60, and then those tag adjustments were done at 20 after. But it sounds like what you're saying, let me back up. And I specifically asked if they could be continued to be adjusted down in real time, and the answer was they would only be curtailed after that point if you were in an EEA3. I think I just heard now that you said that they could be adjusted down in real time.
Let me clarify. They're not physically adjusted down. It's just for the purpose of counting upward flexible capacity. It assumes that those exports could be curtailed in real time, so following the Haas market clearance based on good operator practice.
That's not really an answer to my question, because the statement last week from the CAISO was that they would not be cut in real time unless the CAISO was in an EEA3.
Just to clarify, because the audio is so hard to hear, the point that was being made by Janice Bacon, I believe, of Pacificor, is that the CAISO has explained the circumstances in which they would curtail exports of various priority in real time. And for most high priority, even the lower high priority exports would not be curtailed after the HASP unless warranted by EEA. What Kyle was explaining here is something separate, which was the justification that was used to make this change in the RSE test. This change was made and implemented with the justification that in those extreme circumstances, these exports could be curtailed and thus shouldn't be included in the flexibility test, essentially demand curve. So I hope that helps clarify what we're talking about two slightly different things.
It doesn't fully answer my question, but I'm willing to take it offline.
Okay, was there any other questions in the queue?
I'm not showing any other callers in queue at this time.
I see something in the chat just flashed on my screen. Can you read that out?
This is another question from BPA. And the question is, are you suggesting that assuming they're curtailable, that assuming they are curtailable reduces the flex test requirement?
Right, so I wouldn't characterize this as impacting the test requirement. I would characterize this as impacting the supply, which is counted towards meeting the requirement. And yes, the real-time LPT and economic exports are now counted as additional supply, as additional flexible ramping capacity towards meeting the requirement, based on the assumption that these schedules could be curtailed. Exactly, yeah. So that additional flexible ramping capacity would help the CAISO balancing area to pass the resource efficiency evaluation. Okay, if there's not any other, oh, I see a hand raised. We can take that now.
Hi, Kyle. This is JK from PG&E again. I have a quick question. My understanding is that this help to like by reducing by adding to the supply. This is the only one side, right? For namely that the low priority exports will not be counted in the will be counted in CAISO's supply, but they will not be counted to those entities receiving the exports. Is that right?
Right, so this does not affect, you're asking about whether the impact to balancing areas outside of the CAISO?
Yeah.
You're right, so yeah, none of these enhancements impact any of the balancing areas outside of the CAISO balancing area. So for other balancing areas, import and export schedules outside of the WEIM would just be treated as the change from the previous hour to the evaluation hour.
You mean outside the CAISO, but within the WEIM, right?
Right. For in terms of like the base transfers.
Yes. Okay. I see. Okay. So potentially, even though the operators assume that those lower priority exports can be curtailed, they maybe not, because the exported entities may still take it because that's not counted in their RSE. Is that the right way to say it? Okay.
Yeah.
Got you.
So like if you look at the capacity test, it takes out those low priority real-time exports and economic exports from the CAISO's capacity test, making it easier for CAISO to pass the RSE. But on the opposite side of those schedules, it does not, make it more difficult for other balancing areas to pass.
Got you. Okay, that's really helpful. And I don't know if you have a slide showing that. Do you have any insights that how often or how much these assumptions got realized? That say, operators assume the curtailment can be taken in real time, but actually, how much curtailment was made?
Right. I don't have any slides on that. I understand. Yeah, I wonder if that's something we can include in a future report. I'll have to think about that.
Okay, yeah, that would be very interesting to see. Thank you.
Are there any final questions on the export schedules and CAISO's RSC?
There's another question in the chat. This is from John Dieppe. And again, if you could please identify the company you represent. And his question is, has DMM ever had a chance to analyze how often the advisory imports actually materialized in the real time? Sorry, I'm getting another chat on top of it. SCE. And let me get back. Has DMM ever had a chance to analyze how often the advisory imports actually materialized in the real time, more particularly during the periods mentioned in July from the 17th to the 27th? So this, I think, is asking about the advisory WEIM imports.
Right, and the idea is that there was a concern that the advisory WEIM imports that are clearing these HAS schedules don't actually show up in the 5-minute market. So the question is whether what are the numbers on that, how often that occurs, and that is not something that we've done analysis on yet, to my knowledge, but that's maybe that's something we can look at more.
I would recommend that ISO is publishing monthly reports. The report for July should contain some in-depth analysis on the difference between WEIM imports into CAISO in the HASP versus the RTPD. So I recommend reading that when it's out. I'm hoping it's out shortly.
All right, thanks, Sean, for the question.
All right, one more question in the chat. Were DMM or stakeholders aware that the low priority exports would be treated this way in the RSE test prior to implementation by the CAISO? And that is another question from BPA.
So from the stakeholder process, it was clear that these would be removed from the resource efficiency evaluation. I think it was a little bit less clear the specifics of how that would work, particularly in the flexibility test. So it is just something that I'm trying to provide a little bit more transparency on, but it was discussed and determined that these schedules would be accounted for in both tests. Okay, if that was the last question, did that answer your question, or is there any others?
You do have a hand raised?
I'll be quick. This is Robert Fisher with NV Energy. These change in results, do we know if that would have led to a failure of CAISO, or is it the pass margin much higher?
Right. So in the July report, I did say this, and I found that in July particularly, this enhancement had no impact on CAISO passing or failing the test. They still would have passed the resource efficiency evaluation, the capacity, and the flexibility test in every interval in July, even without this enhancement. In August, I'm putting together that presentation, but I think there would have been a few intervals where it would have made a difference.
Thank you for the clarification.
And we have another hand raised. Caller, your line is unmuted.
This is Jenny Mystery from Saltrio Project. So my question is, these real-time LPT exports or economic exports, if they clear HAS, shouldn't the T-40 test reflect the outcome of the HAS and then not count that capacity towards the test?
Right. So the test reflects the information almost right after HASP. And is your question, should the exports be counted, or was it should they not be counted? Say that.
So if the exports are cleared at HASP,
yeah,
you know, the results are published at T50, T-58 or so. So shouldn't, if 100 megawatt of LPT is cleared in HASP, then shouldn't the supply side of on CAISO's test should be decreased by 100?
Right. So if you have a 100 megawatt real-time LPT that clears HASP, maybe in part to WEIM imports, maybe not, that 100 megawatt day ahead LPT or real-time LPT, 100 megawatt real-time LPT would be removed from CAISO's RSC.
Okay, so what you're suggesting is the test T-75 or T-55 may consider all of this real-time LPT export on the supply side of CAISO's equation for capacity test and would be counted towards upward capacity. But T-40, whatever the results that are published by HAS, if that result decreased, from the supply, then that supply will be taken out. So that margin will be taken out from CAISO's capacity test.
Right. The way I would characterize it is, yeah, the resource efficiency evaluation sees those results coming out of HASP, and then makes the adjustment to the real-time low priority and economic exports. So to remove that extra demand.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, I know we're running out of time here, so let me get to the next section. I might do an abbreviated version here, but this is looking at assistance energy transfers, which is a voluntary program to give balancing areas access to excess WEIM supply that might not have been available otherwise. So normally failing the upward flexibility or upward capacity test, that's going to impose a limit on the amount of WEIM imports that can come in. But opting into the assistance energy transfer program will prevent the WEIM transfers from being limited, but there would be a after-the-fact surcharge. For the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide. We'll post the presentation online after the call, but this slide goes into what the surcharge for assistance energy transfer looks like. And I wanted to at least get to this example. This example highlights the impact of assistance energy transfers during a RSC failure under two conditions. The first condition is when the imposed import limit is high and not restrictive. And the second condition is when the import limit following a test failure, let's say it's low and restrictive on the solution. And in this example, I'm saying that the optimal WEIM import without any limit is 100 megawatts. I'm also assuming that the failure amount is higher, so let's say 150 megawatts. So the point on this slide is, first, opting into the Assistance Energy Transfer Program does not guarantee that the balancing area will achieve additional WEIM supply relative to opting out. All it does is remove the import limit that would have been in place following a test failure, which would then allow the market to freely schedule WEIM transfers based on conditions in the system. So if the import limit was not restrictive on the solution, then opting into the program isn't going to have an effect on achieving additional energy, but there would still be a surcharge just based on the level of transfers. But on the other side, when the import limit is restricting transfers, so in like the red line on the right side, then opting into the Assistance Energy Transfer Program would result in additional WEIM imports. So you can see on the right column, the limit is relaxed and 75 megawatts of additional energy is achieved up to where the market wants to go in 100 megawatts. So I know we are short on time. If the report goes into more detail on assistance energy transfers and provides a metric that kind of goes into some of the a little bit into the impact of doing so in terms of whether or not it would have achieved additional energy or not. And then also, if there are any questions, you can always reach out to dmm@kaiso.com, and we can get back to you there. Amelia, is there anything you want to say, or?
I'll just add thank you to everybody for attending the call today. The recording will be posted along with the slides. The reports are already posted and contain a lot of additional information. As Kyle mentioned, I really appreciate the questions, so please do feel free to send us any questions that you have by email, and we'll be happy to take those. DMM@kaiso.com. With that, let's close the call. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.